Good afternoon. My name is Jakob Stogard Nielsen, and I'm a lecturer in the School of European Languages, Culture and Society. And it is my great pleasure, on behalf of the organizing committee, to welcome you to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture. Today's speaker is lecturer in Russian cinema and culture, Dr. Rachel Morley. And the title of her talk is Russian Cinema in 1915. It forms part of the centenary celebrations of the UCL School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. Welcome, and over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Jakob's already answered my first question, which is why cinema in 1915 specifically, and the answer is that it's part of the centenary this year. The department of UCL that I belong to was founded on the 19th of October 1915, and so this lecture has been envisaged as part of the centenary celebrations that we're holding this year. But it's not the only reason. Russian cinema, from the perspective of Russian film history, 1915 is a year that's worth considering in its own right and celebrating, because it was a pivotal year in the history and development of Russian cinema. First, I want to give you some idea of where 1915 lies in that history. So, the first films were screened in Russia in early May 1896, when the French company, the Lumiere brothers, brought some of their films to St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Nizhny Novgorod. But for the next 11 to 12 years, cinema in Russia was dominated entirely by the French. Lumiere, Pathé Frères, Gaumont, they all set up their own film companies in Russia and made films there aimed at the Russian market, but with French money, French actors, and so on. Foreign-made feature films were also imported and screened in this period as well. And it was not until 1907 when the first Russian production studios were set up. And then it was only in 1908 that the first Russian-made feature film was established and screened. A film called Stenka Razin that was screened for the first time on the 15th of October 1908. So, when we arrive at Russian cinema in 1915, the film industry is not quite 7 years old. In what ways then was this year so significant? The main reason was that it was the start of a boom period for the Russian film industry. It was the year in which the entire industry expanded and developed in a way that it had never done in any of the previous 7 years. Why this happened in 1915 is due to a complex combination of different factors that were both internal to the film industry in Russia and external to it. And one of the main reasons was probably the First World War. The First World War had begun for Russia on the 1st of August 1914, and apart from the other problems it created, it also meant that Russian distribution companies could no longer easily obtain films from abroad. And this was a big problem for them. At this time, foreign films accounted for nearly all of the films that were shown in Russia. In fact, in 1914, 90% of all the films that were shown in Russia were foreign. So this was a problem. And by early 1915, it had become obvious that the First World War was not going to be over very quickly. So it was a problem that needed a solution. And it also became obvious to the very astute Russian businessmen who ran the film industry in Russia, it was a privately owned industry, that a gap had therefore opened in the market, a gap that they could fill by making their own Russian films and establishing more Russian-based companies to do that. And they moved very quickly to fill it. So the massive growth that ensued in the wake of that realization was visible in all areas of the Russian film industry in 1915. So the number of film studios grew. In 1913, there had been only 18 film studios in Russia. In 1915, by the end of that year, there were 47. So the number of studios almost doubled in just 2 years. And indeed, by 1915, the Russian takeover of the market was considered to be so complete that the long-established studio Pathé Frères closed its office down and left Russia. The size of existing studios also grew in this period, both in terms of the staff that they employed and in terms of their facilities. And the Russian trade press from 1915 is full of pictures like this one that are showing off the new studios that production companies have built. So this is one from the Khanjankov production company, which was the largest company in Russia in 1915. It had been one of the first to be set up in 1907. And you can see it's boasting this extraordinary glass superstructure in order to let daylight in so that they could film with natural light if they wanted to. And Han Jankov, like I say, it was the largest company, and in 1915 it employed what they described as a colossal staff. They were very fond of the word colossal. Everything was colossal. So they had 2 directors, 50 actors, and 5 cameramen, all on permanent contracts and very high salaries. So as a result of this expansion, the number of films made in Russia also increased. If we look at the production figures, we see that as well. So in 1913, 129 films were made in Russia, most of which were short films, so less than an hour in length. And by 1915, 370 films were made in that 1 year, and almost all of those were full-length feature films. There was also an increase in the number of people going to the cinema at this time in Russia, and an increase in the number of cinemas there as well. You can see, again, extraordinary growth. In 1913, there were 1,400 cinemas in Russia, of which 130 were in St. Petersburg. And by the end of 1915, that number had, again, more than doubled to reach 4,000, with 229 cinemas in Petrograd as St. Petersburg became known after the start of the First World War. And there were 15 cinemas just on Nevsky Prospect alone, which that's the main thoroughfare that runs through the centre of St. Petersburg. It's 4.5 kilometres long, so 15 cinemas in that space. It gives you a cinema every 300 metres or so, which is quite extraordinary. So, 1915 was, therefore, the year in which Russian cinema became properly Russian. Russian films made in Russia by Russian companies had become dominant on the Russian cinema screens for the first time since the first Russian feature film was made in 1908. And I mentioned already that in 1914, 90% of the films that had been screened in Russia were foreign. Well, in 1915, that turned completely on its head, and only 10% of the films that were screened in Russia in 1915 were foreign. The remaining 90% were all Russian. So this was an entirely new phenomenon. This had never happened before. And this shift in the sort of enthusiasm for Russian-made films also led to changes in taste on the part of Russian cinema goers. Before 1915, the favourites of the Russian audiences were all foreign film stars, in particular Asta Nielsen and Max Linder. Asta was a Danish star of German cinema, very popular in the early 1910s, and Max Linder, the French comic actor, whose films were popular all the way through the 1910s and even into the 20s, if people could get to see them at that point. And they were popular because their films were screened widely, but also because there were no Russian film stars at all until about 1915. Again, it's striking that this is the year in which that changed. One reason for that is because all the best stage actors in Russia looked down their noses somewhat at cinema acting when it was first introduced. They saw it as a lower class activity, not really art, and something much less credible and substantial than theatre acting. But again, once they saw the industry expanding, they decided pretty much en masse, these great theatre stars, that actually they would act in cinema after all, probably attracted by the fame and the money that went with it, but also because at this point, filmmaking started to change from being a novelty and an attraction to being an art form. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So an article published in the journal Theatre and Cinema on the 15th of November 1915 noted that, quote, everybody of note in the theatre world was trying out film acting. And indeed, the actors and actresses who entered Russian cinema at this time would all go on to be the greatest film stars. And the most popular male actors were known as the kings of the screen. And they included Ivan Mazhukhin, who was possibly one of the most famous actors of the period. He left the stage for cinema in 1915, lured away from a theatre by a production company that offered him a large salary. And he emigrated in 1919 after the revolution and had a second career as Mashukin in the French film industry. And Vladimir Nabokov wrote about seeing his films in his memoir, Speak Memory, speaking about his steely eye, and in particular the celebrated little muscle that twitched under the tight skin of his jaw. Another famous star from the period was Vladimir Maximov. He'd begun his acting career at the Mali Theatre and the Moscow Art Theatre before turning to film also in 1915. He was considered one of the best actors, but also one of the most handsome. And there was also Witold Polonsky, who, again, an actor at the Mali Theatre, joined cinema in 1915. The female film stars from this period were correspondingly called the queens of the screen, and the two most famous of them are Vera Kholodnaya. She was actually unique. She was the only star of this period of Russian cinema who didn't come to cinema from the stage. She entered cinema without any acting experience, starting off in a bit part role in a film made in 1914, where she played a guest at a ball scene in an adaptation of Anna Karenina. But then in 1915, she joined Khanzhankov, and that's when she became famous. And the second major film star of the period, female film star, was Vera Karaly. Karaly was a prima ballerina with the Russian Imperial Ballet. And when her dancing career was temporarily interrupted by injury in 1914, she turned to screen acting. And a lot of the roles that she played were of dancers. This picture in the middle is from her first film role, Chrysanthemums, where she starts the film as a ballerina, performing a very traditional ballet performance, and ends up performing an Isadora Duncan-style dance on the stage with bare feet. She was considered one of the most beautiful actresses of her generation. So cults sprang up around these figures in 1915, and they became the main draws for the audience. Their names were used as the selling points for the films. Before that, it had always referred to the screenplay writer, not, interestingly, normally to the director. But from 1915, that changed. So I just want to show you here, this is a film poster for Vera Kholodnaya's first film with Bauer and Khanzhankov. And you can see that's her name there at the bottom in small letters and placed after the name of the two male stars who she's starring with. This film was released in August in 1915, and it catapulted her to stardom, and it's reflected in the next poster for her next film, where here we see this is her name. Yeah, so much bigger, and also in first position, ahead of the male film star. The same with Vera Karaly. This is a film poster for a film called After Death. Here we do see the director's name, interestingly, and we're going to be talking about him later on, Evgeny Bauer. But again, her name in large letters and in front of the male star. But just look, as the year progresses, they get bigger. This is her name here, and this is her name, okay? Alongside all these changes then, 1915 was also the year in which there were considerable shifts in the attitudes and habits of the Russian cinema goers. And two of the most noticeable changes that took place were the fact that the composition of the average cinema audience changed, and also the public's attitude to cinema going as an activity changed as well. So I already said that in its first years, cinema was seen as a novelty, an attraction. People went to the cinema really just to experience that. They weren't particularly interested in what they were watching. And before 1914, the audience would choose which cinema to go to on a list of things that didn't include the films until way sort of at number 7. So they'd choose it based on its size. They liked big cinemas, how grand it was, how many fire exits the cinema had. Cinema fires were really common in the 1910s, and so the cinemas would advertise, we have 10 fire exits on their posters to encourage people to go. How comfortable they were was also a consideration. What the foyer looked like. The foyer was a place where people liked to go and stand and wait to go in and see the film. But some sort of cinemas that were not so rich would switch their lights off and not let people stand in there in the light. So that was an important consideration. The quality of the musical accompaniment was something else they'd consider, with live music preferred to a gramophone recording, and only then did they look at what film was being shown. And in this point as well, the audiences who went to the cinema were characterised by their all-embracing social inclusivity. Everybody went to the cinema, and they went to the same cinema. Okay? So cinema at this period, before 1915, was a place where people from all different classes would mingle, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in the same space. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that in 1915 in Russia, that was not common. So at the beginning of 1912, a Russian journalist wrote about this experience, and we've got lots of memoir accounts suggesting that this was common. I'm quoting, "If you look at the auditorium, the composition of the audience will amaze you. Everyone is there. Students, policemen, writers and prostitutes, office girls, officers, girl students, all kinds of bearded and bespectacled intellectuals, workers, shop assistants, tradesmen, society ladies, dressmakers, civil servants, in a word, everyone." So this social diversity made cinema going very different from theatre going in this period. Theatre, a sort of a higher art form, attracted a more homogenous, higher class public. And cinema going was very different from theatre going in other ways as well at this period. Cinema going before 1914 was a casual thing, as I've suggested. It was an impromptu experience. There was no need to book tickets in advance. You could just turn up and get them on the door, so no planning required, whereas an evening at the theatre required considerable planning. You didn't have to dress up. You didn't have to put your dinner jacket on or whatever. In fact, there was no need even to take your coats off or your boots off. You were allowed to keep your outdoor clothes on in the cinema. You didn't need to stick to the start times of the films. The programmes were screened on a loop, and people could come in and go out at any point in the screening. And there were no intervals, so you didn't have to be seen. You didn't have to mingle and have to socialise. So it was very free and easy. And by contrast, theatre going had this whole complex system of etiquette, a code of conduct, if you like, about what to wear, when to arrive, who to talk to, and so on. So there was a freedom around cinema going before 1915, and it lacked those rigid codes. But gradually, as attitudes to cinema changed, attitudes to cinema going changed as well. And perhaps ironically, the habits became closer to those associated with theatre going. And again, this happened in and around 1915. So, for example, it began to be expected that people would dress for the cinema and they would take off their clothes, and especially their hats. This is a cartoon that comes from a journal from 1915 in which the little boy is saying, "Madam," well, you can see what he's saying, I've translated it for you. So, this was sort of part of the campaign to get people to remember that they should dress properly. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have gone to him yet. Different social classes also began to stick together. So the variety of people within the audience disappeared, and different classes would tend to favour different cinemas. And people also began to stick to a timetable, especially as the films became longer. They would want to see the start of the film, so they would go for the start point and they would leave at the end. And the films themselves became more important, a much more important part of the experience of film going, more the focus of the visit. And many of these changes in behaviour and attitude are summed up really nicely in an article that was published in a journal, again in 1915, and it's cited by the film historian Yuri Tsivian in one of his articles on early Russian film. It's very revealing and worth quoting at length, so again I'm going to quote for you. "The kind of cinema goer who chews seeds and guffaws at dramatic moments is already dying out. Now you get the same sort of people who flock to the theatre. The public is now evolving its own tastes, even beginning to have its favourite actors and actresses. The public, which at first only dropped into the cinema in passing and was attracted by the fact that, as the posters announced, you do not have to take off your galoshes and outer garments, is now beginning to see serial pictures and going 2 or even 3 evenings to see the same film story over and over again." Tsivian also cites another commentator who notes that these changes in cinema-going habits were reflected in the language that people used to talk about this activity. Again, I'm quoting, "People no longer say they drop into the cinema," he wrote. "They go to the cinema or visit the cinema as they would the theatre." So in 1915, alongside all these changes, there was also a shift in the way that the filmmakers themselves began to see filmmaking. They began to approach it more seriously as an art form, rather than just as a novelty or as a commercial undertaking. We first start to see this shift in the paradigm of how cinema was viewed from novelty to art in around late 1912. Just in a couple of films, we're starting to see the beginning of this interest in cinema as an art form. But it was during 1915 that this change in perspective became widely established. By the end of this year, cinema is considered and received as an art form in Russia, and as an art form that increasingly can compete with other forms of high culture and high-class entertainment. So, what sort of films could a cinema goer see in Russia in 1915? Well, the first thing to say is that there would have been a lot of choice. 370 films were made in Russia in that year, and almost all of those films were acted feature films. 45 of them have survived, and the CEAS library holds several of them in the Bain Graphy film collection. So if you're interested in viewing them, and you're a member of UCL, you can do that by going to the CEAS library. Okay, so what sort of films were there? War films. We might have expected lots of war films in 1915. No, there were hardly any war films. By the end of 1914, enthusiasm for this sort of thing had died out, and although between August and December 1914, almost half of all the feature films made were about the war, so 50 out of 103 films. In 1915, there were only 21 fiction films out of 370 made about the war, so not even 6%. There were no films with overtly revolutionary content either, as we might expect, given that the film industry was privately owned. There were some slapstick farces. People liked to go and have a laugh, but not very many, possibly because Max Linder had stolen that particular genre. There were some other comedies that tended to prefer sort of gentle social satire, but again, not very many. There were quite a lot of literary adaptations, so this year, new versions of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, 2 versions of Tolstoy's War and Peace, and so on. There were some detective films made in a series with the same protagonist as the star of every one. But the vast majority of films made in this year were urban melodramas set in the early 20th century present of their making, and mostly set in Moscow. And it was this genre, the melodrama, that during 1915 helped cinema to become an art form. So I want to show you now some examples just to demonstrate the level of artistic sophistication that this relatively new art form of cinema had reached in Russia in 1915. And this can best be done by showing you some films made by the director Evgeny Bauer. All of the films I'm going to talk about now were made in 1915. Bauer is the key Russian director of this period of filmmaking. His mastery was acknowledged in his own day. You saw on one of the film posters I showed you that his name appears. Very few other directors ever had their names shown on the posters for their films. It didn't matter who had made most of them. But when Bauer had made a film, it did, because people wanted to see it. And now his reputation, since his films were rediscovered at the end of the 1980s, is that he is not only the major Russian filmmaker of this period of Russian filmmaking, but also a really fundamental person in the whole of world cinema. Bauer was doing things tucked away in Russia that even the Italians hadn't started to do, and they're often considered the sort of masters in cinematic innovation in this period. So what do Bauer's films contribute to innovation, to the development of cinema as an art in this year? Well, mostly formal innovation and experimentation. He was concerned with cinematic innovation to a great degree. And this can be seen in all aspects of the films that he makes. He designed extraordinary sets for his films. A lot of early films just look like film theatre. They have a backdrop and a few chairs and tables, and that's about it. It looks like you're watching a stage show that's been filmed. But Bauer set out to create a sense of depth and a sense of perspective, and he constructed really extraordinary sets to help him do that. I'm going to show you some clips, and you'll see some of his sets as we're doing that. He also explored, I'm just going to skip through these because I'm aware that time is running on and I want to show you the film clips. He also explored lighting. Okay, this is a shot from 1915 where we see a style of lighting that's called now Rembrandt lighting or low-key lighting. And that's the sort of lighting that emanates from one key source, so like the lamp here, it's intended to look realistic, and the fireplace over here as well, while leaving the rest of the set in darkness. Okay. Now this character who we're meeting, this is the opening shot of this film, he is, as we will see as the film progresses, a recluse, an antisocial, hermit-like figure who's transfixed by the memory of his dead mother and who can barely bring himself to leave the comfort of his own home. that picture, that image is telling us that. Yeah? And the next shot stresses it again, because Bauer cuts to this shot, and at first we're not sure what it is, but then it becomes clear that it's the doorway to the room that we've just been looking at. A woman opens it, she's his aunt who looks after him, and she's allowed to enter the room. She can go in, you can just see her there at the side of the screen. But the camera stays where it is, it doesn't go in. And again, this sense of a reclusive person, separate from society, is created both by the set that's designed and the positioning of the camera, but also by the lighting. Okay, Bauer and his cameramen also explored the camera's potential to create meaning. And they did this by experimenting with different types of shots, but also by making the camera mobile. This was something that didn't happen in early film normally. There were conventions, in fact, that stated that the camera had to be static, almost as if it was the ideal, probably somewhere where you're sitting there. It had to be looking at the action from the middle of the auditorium, as if it were the ideal position in a theatre. But Bauer decided that he wanted to change that. So I'm going to show you a clip. Just bear with me while I get it up. This is again from the film that we've just seen, After Death, from 1915. And it's an extraordinary sequence in which the hermit-like male protagonist we've just been introduced to is taken to a social gathering by one of his friends, or by his only friend, actually. And it's an extraordinary shot. This whole sequence lasts for 4 and a bit minutes, and you will see for yourselves in a minute why it's so remarkable. Okay. So let's start here. So we start. You can see the camera's already moving, but this is a panning shot. It's moving from side to side. So this is not the most extraordinary aspect of this sequence yet, but again, you can see Bauer's trying to show us how big the gathering is. He's trying to show us all the different people who are there. And also, Yuri Tsiviana suggested that part of the function of this shot is to show how the news is spreading among the guests. The hermit's coming. He's going to be here in a minute. His friend's bringing him. And you can sort of see that the news is travelling through as they're speaking. And this is a crowd scene, actually, to manage this many characters. Right, here we get the start of the tracking shot. So we get Andrei arriving. He's played by Vitor Polonsky, one of the kings of the screen. Now suddenly the camera starts to move again, and this is very complex movement because it's moving both to the side, so it's panning, but in a minute it's going to start to move backwards in what's called a tracking out shot. You can see it's moving. Now we're not sure how exactly Bauer achieved this. Tsivian has suggested that he constructed a sort of makeshift wheeled platform with 2 bicycles with a plank of wood across them and put the camera on top. But even if you think of him doing that with 2 bicycles, how to get the movement back and to the side at the same time, it's extremely complex. And again, what the camera seems to be doing, because camera movement always means something in these films, it's not just a novelty, it seems to be functioning to convey again to us this character's social alienation, his sort of the agony that he's experiencing in having to be in this social place and being introduced to all these people. The camera's pretty merciless. It keeps coming back. It keeps saying, no, no, you can't go. You've got to come with me. Follow me. Then again to the side, now to the left. Back again, still further to go. Camera, in not letting Andrei, the protagonist, out of its sight, is again reflecting the scrutiny that he's subjected to. His friend here, he's much more free. He can move around, he can move out of the sight of the camera, as he's about to do now. But Andrei is always in sight. The camera always is focusing on him. And this sequence is pretty much a first, not just in Russian cinema, but in world cinema as well. I know there were films made in 1914 in Italy that had mobile cameras, but this complexity is rare even in those films. And those Italian films hadn't been screened in Russia at this point. They were screened only in the summer of 1916. So this is something that Bauer has arrived at. Okay, and then this is the key point of this whole sequence, because we're now meeting the protagonist, female protagonist here. This is Vera Carali, one of the queens of the screen, and she is going to fall madly in love at first sight with this socially awkward Andrei. Again, we'll see Bauer's clever use of camera angle, so Andrei can't talk to her, has to go and sit down. And the next shot shows us him from her perspective. So this is her looking at him. She's making him the object of her gaze. Bauer's telling us that because, people couldn't read these devices always. They were new. So he shows that by showing us her looking, and then by an intertitle telling us that. So we've got these three different things that are helping us to see that. Andrei, in the end, he can't stand it anymore. He runs away. He leaves, leaving the camera still. The camera doesn't move anymore, along with the girl, Zoya, watching him leave. Okay, I want to show another point, another section from this film just very quickly, and then we'll finish, because this film also contains one of the earliest examples of the use of an extreme close-up in Russian cinema. So a close-up would normally show a character's whole face. An extreme close-up shows part of it. The focus of the close-up is the female protagonist, Zoya, who we've just seen, and it occurs later in the film when Andrei attends one of her performances. She's an actress, okay? And she gives a stage performance reading one of Pushkin's poems, and he attends. The sequence is brief, but it's very powerful. And again, this is a first. So I'm going to show you the clip. Okay, so she's reciting from Pushkin. Raise in the audience again, the slightly raised perspective suggesting that that's her view of him. She's looking at him. Again, he runs away. Can't stand to stay there, leave. And the sequence is about to happen now. She comes back onto stage, and then the camera cuts to her face. Camera tracks in. She takes a slight step towards the camera, and then there's a fade, and it moves to darkness. Okay? So that sequence is also a very early example of what is known as direct address, where a character in a film breaks the imaginary fourth wall and stares directly into the camera and beyond it at the viewer. And that sequence within the context of the film has many different meanings, and people are still sort of debating what they think it means. But it seems to me, and this has also been suggested by my CEAS colleague, Dr. Phil Cavendish, who's written on the poetics of the camera in early revolutionary, pre-revolutionary film, that one of the most important aspects of this shot is its extra-diegetic status. By that I mean it actually exists outside the world of the film and outside the events of the plot that we're watching. What I think we get in this extraordinary sequence, if I can put it on properly so that you can see the whole of the face, is an attempt by Bauer to show us Vera Carali, the actress, okay? So not the actress she's playing, not Zoya, the actress she's playing, but Vera Carali, the actress who is acting in this film. I said earlier that Carali was one of the most famous, most adored, most beautiful actresses of the period, and she did go on to become a huge star. And by December of 1916, her fame was so great that she was allegedly used as the lure in the plot to kill the so-called mad monk, Grigory Rasputin. She was apparently promised as a present at the Moika Palace in St. Petersburg on the night that Rasputin went there and met his death. Okay? And after death, this film is probably the film that did the most to create her fame and her status as a film star. And we might even see that this is one of Bauer's aims in the film. If you look very carefully at her eyes here, you can see the dual reflections of the two arc lights that would have been positioned either side of her face to light this extraordinary portrait shot. So what we're getting here is Vera Karaly as the film star. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morley. We have 5 minutes for questions, and we have some microphones coming, so please wait for a microphone. Yeah, there's close over here.
Thanks, that was a very interesting talk. I was just intrigued by that poster for the first Russian film. Just wondering, could you tell us anything about it?
The one for...
One, the very, very beginning, yeah.
On the cover of the talk, or this one?
No, the one with the colour post. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, this was designed for the film. I don't know very much about it other than that. It's a very famous image, and it's a drawn image from 1908, and it picks out the key sort of elements of the story. The film focuses on Stenka Razin, who was a 17th, I think, century rebel who led sort of rebellions against the Tsars along the Volga. But this film doesn't talk about Razin the hero. It talks about Razin's obsession with a Persian princess whom he's captured during skirmishes in Persia. And there are songs, Russian drinking songs actually, that talk about this story, and the scenario for the film was based on that. And so you can see the Persian princess does her dance in this section. And then the men the brigands, Razin's men, don't like the fact that he's obsessed by her, so they plot to have her removed by spinning a story that she's unfaithful to Razin. He believes the plot, and the film ends with an extraordinary scene where he just picks her up and throws her in the Volga, and she drowns. So the first Russian feature film gets us off to quite a good start, because nearly all Russian films in this period end with somebody being murdered or somebody killing themselves. It's not always the woman, often, but not always. So yeah, that sets us off well.
Thank you very much. You have a question here?
Hello.
Very interesting talk. I've got two little questions. One is, you compared the films with the Italian films, but what about the comparison with, say, Birth of a Nation and Griffiths, who perhaps was different in that he portrayed a political dogma against African Americans? But the other thing which occurred to me after I'd written down that I wanted to ask that was, what about the prices of these films? Because in early American films, the prices, were sort of very, very cheap. And what was the social aspect in that? Did they serve drinks or sweets or anything like that?
You mean the tickets to go and see the films?
Yeah, the tickets to see the film. And also, did they sort of have, did they sell sweets and stuff like that?
So the Griffiths question is, a good one. Obviously, you can't mention 1915 without thinking about that film. And I don't know enough about whether that film was known in Russia. It certainly... in preparing this talk, I've scrolled through all of the existing journals that we have in our online source in SEAS Library, and there's no mention of it in 1915, but it could have been that it was shown later. But again, that's sort of a unique feature of Russian film in this period, is its emphasis on melodrama, its emphasis on gender, relations and problems between men and women, and seemingly ignoring everything that's going around it in terms of social turmoil and political turmoil of the period. As regards the cinema-going experience, yes, it was pretty similar to today. Not popcorn, probably, but like the seeds. The Russian peasants would have liked to chew and spit out and drop the seeds everywhere. They would have been sold. And certainly ice cream. And also some of the theatres even had aspired to be places of relaxation, so you could go and relax a bit before you watch the film. So some even had fountains in the arcades and little gardens as well. They were huge structures, some of them. But it really depended. There were lots of different sorts of cinemas, some that could seat 2,000 people, some that could only seat a few tens. Depended where they were and what they were. So very, very vastly different.
Any chance of any age goers?
No, I think there were age limits on children going.
Yeah, probably time for a few more questions, one or two, if they're short. There's one right up there.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for a lovely talk. I wanted to ask, was cinema a phenomenon in cities, so metropolitan? When did it actually spread out?
Yes, it was uniquely urban in the pre-revolutionary period. And it was only probably after the revolution when the Bolsheviks took over and realized very, very quickly that cinema was a powerful tool of agitation and propaganda, that they set up agit trains. So they would put screening equipment onto trains and send them out around the country screening propaganda films. But yeah, in this period it was almost uniquely urban, which probably explains the focus on urban themes and topics, because that was what the audience knew and what they wanted to see.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all the time we have. Please join me in thanking Dr. Morley for this wonderful lecture. Thank you.